Hey everybody, welcome. My name is Matthew. Thank you very much for joining. Today I'm going to continue on my series with the United States public debt. Going to move into the 20th century. I'm going to talk about World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam War. Okay, so picking up where we left off yesterday. This period, very stable, gold standard. And as you see, the United States debt did explode from very, very low levels, under 100 million before the Civil War, to $2.7 billion. That fell, and then it went back up towards World War I. But this period, as I mentioned in the last video, was during the international gold standard, which did anchor most currencies around the world to gold. It was a period of gradually falling prices and price stability. And this period was as well, I think I failed to mention this in the last video, this was the highest growth in terms of the economy, GDP, etc., that the United States had experienced, or any economy had experienced for that matter, up until this point. And I believe unmatched really by any economy until China, probably this century, in the 21st century. And you can see that the debt didn't rise during this period. So it's not true that debt needs to rise for economic growth. As well, we had a gold standard anchoring the currency. So now I'm going to move into the 20th century. I'm going to look at the wars primarily. As I mentioned, wars cause the most public borrowing typically ever. There's many famous quotes about this. We can see here that the national debt, the federal debt, public debt of the United States exploded from, it made its way back up here, the latter part of the 1800s and the start of the 20th century, to over $2 billion again. But then you see once the US entered World War I, the classical gold standard collapsed here at the start of World War I. The United States massively expanded its public debt to finance their entry into war. So literally went up 10 times from 3 billion roughly to 30 billion. Now I'm zoomed out again. Let's go ahead and zoom in through the Gold Reserve Act and from when World War I started. So here we zoomed in again. Here's the massive expansion of the United States balance sheet to fund its entry into World War I. Here's the Great Depression. The national debt has actually fallen. And here's the Gold Reserve Act that Roosevelt passed quickly after entering office to make the holding of gold illegal for Americans. He also devalued gold right after this. What else happened, though, during this period? And I've talked about this many times in prior videos. Well, the Federal Reserve, the Central Bank of the United States, has lasted for over 100 years now. Unlike the first Bank of the United States, the second Bank of the United States, which had their respective charters revoked after 20 years, both times. The Federal Reserve has been around for over 100 years now. And this is definitely the X factor in the economy. It's monopoly. It's a government license from the state, from the United States, to print money. And of course, we can expect that they will be involved in the financing of the public debt. But the history of this is not so cut and dry. It's not so clean as you might expect. You might expect, when I put the Federal Reserve's portion of the United States' overall debt, you might expect it to rise in proportion here. And that's just not the case in the early years. This was practice, as they like to say in the Federal Reserve. Do see my prior videos on the discount rate and how they had a role in the Great Depression. When the Federal Reserve started, they actually didn't buy many United States securities at all. And up until the Great Depression, again, they opened their doors in 1914, there were no open market operations, the Fed buying government bonds as they do today and as we think of central banking today. So what I'm going to show you now, and I alluded to this in the last video, I'm going to show you the federal debt holdings of the central bank. That is, when the central bank prints money as a liability on its balance sheet ex nihilo. They can buy anything with it, but typically today they buy government bonds. So let's see how that looked at the dawn of the Central Bank of the United States. Okay, it's the dark green portion here. Doesn't look so much as a proportion of the debt. A little bit different when we get to the 30s, but as far as World War I goes, now I'll do a percentage to show you exactly how much government paper the Federal Reserve themselves owns of the United States' total debt. Okay? There it is. All right. So as we see here, in the very early years, all the way until the Great Depression, look at that percentage. Okay? We're talking about the debt itself, as I mentioned, gets close to $30 billion when the United States entered World War I and a little bit after. The total United States debt, the Federal Reserve owned 1% of that. Okay, $300 million worth. So what was the Federal Reserve buying during this time from its founding up until the Great Depression? They were actually lending to banks like any other bank. The only difference, of course, was that they could print money ex nihilo to do so. So what the Federal Reserve did in early days was they were lending at their discount window, which wasn't really a discount, it was just a normal rate. Banks were coming to them for loans. Federal Reserve would print money, they would print bank reserves ex nihilo, lend that to the banks, and then on the asset side of the Fed's balance sheet with the money they just lent, the new bank reserves, they would have commercial paper. So they'd have commercial paper, basically loans as an asset to banks, but how did they give that loan? Ex nihilo, they created the money out of thin air and credited them with bank reserves. So that's how it worked. And you can see that as far as what the Federal Reserve, you might understand what central banking does today, it typically buys the sovereign's debt. It buys the US Treasury debt or the German bunds or the UK gilts, whichever respective country your central bank falls in. That's not how it was at the beginning of the Federal Reserve. They were just getting their feet wet, practice, as some economists like to joke. And indeed, they did a lot of lending to banks all the way up until the Great Depression. So, the United States Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, had a very, very minimal impact in the raising of public debt for the United States to enter World War I. You see, 1%. The central bank represented 1% of the buying of the debt that the United States Treasury issued before and during the United States' entry into World War I. Then came the Great Depression. Again, see my prior videos on the discount rate for this. Then the debt starts to rise again. And now we see the percentage rise as well. You can see the dark green, the whale here, indicated by the whale. They've now gone up from a few $100 million worth of debt to, let's say at this point in the mid-30s, $2.4 billion worth of debt, which as a percentage is much higher, okay, where they were down to like 1%, even under 1% most of the time here, up till the Great Depression. Now, all of a sudden, they're owning, even at times, 1933, on the eve of the passage of the Gold Reserve Act, they're owning 10% of United States government paper. Okay, let's reset the zoom. And now I'm going to zoom into World War II, and you're really going to see the money printing begin, but also the explosion of United States debt again. But they're not necessarily lockstep. So let's zoom in again. We'll show World War I all the way up through World War II and the Bretton Woods Conference. So World War II starts here, September 1939, the double attack on Poland, eventually the Baltic states and many other countries in Eastern Europe by both Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia together, Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. World War II started here. Of course, the Nazis had already invaded the Sudetenland and Austria as well. Lots of problems in Europe. The United States debt grew steadily here. It was, again, that $30 billion figure paid down from the end of World War I. The Great Depression, it was actually pretty low, about half that, $16 billion. And it starts to go back up. So when World War II starts primarily in Europe, it's now $40 billion worth of United States debt. And then we can see here the United States enters the war, and they enter in a big way. Okay, so $47 billion of debt all of a sudden turns into $267 billion worth of debt by the time the war is over. Now, the Federal Reserve does increase again, but it's not necessarily a huge number. You can see that it was up to 10%, as I mentioned before, here on the passage of the Gold Reserve Act. Then it was down again, 3.5% of the debt. It's back up again to close to 10%. As the United States gets into the war, again, a lot of gold flows into the Federal Reserve's coffers as well. So the Federal Reserve has a lot of gold on their balance sheet. They don't have, only treasuries, which the majority of their balance sheet today is treasuries. That's just not the case here. You can see it denoted in the green shaded area with the whale. Certainly much bigger than it was just after the Great Depression, 10x higher again. So from 2 billion, now you're up to 20 billion, $20 billion worth of debt. But again, the United States' government's debt has exploded itself. So they're still only 10% of the balance, 10%. So who is the United States issuing that debt to? Well, it's typically the taxpayer, but it's in a more deferred, longer-term way. So war bonds, savings bonds, these types of instruments were issued to Americans of all shapes and sizes. Whether you're a big company or a small mom-and-pop investor, bonds were issued to Americans everywhere, and they bought them. And you can see that the Federal Reserve is a very moderate portion of this at only 10%. All right, now let's go all the way to the Vietnam War. Okay, let's see how it shakes out. The Vietnam War is beginning here in the mid-50s. The debt is rising still all the way through the early 60s, the Kennedy assassination, still about 10%. Okay, so we're now getting over $300 billion in total public debt for the United States. The Federal Reserve still only owns about 10% of that. Let's zoom out and zoom in again. You can see what I'm building up to here with the culmination of the Vietnam War, the Nixon shock, the Vietnam War ending, and this will be the end of this quick video today. Here we can see much more of a push into the public debt by the Federal Reserve. As the 60s wear on, as the war drags on in Vietnam, eventually the Nixon shock. Do see my prior videos on that. You have foreign governments like Charles de Gaulle in France claiming the gold that they entrusted to the United States during the Bretton Woods conference, because a lot of the gold just flowed there naturally to get away from the tyrants of Hitler and Stalin and Mussolini in World War II. That gold starts to be claimed by foreign governments here by the 70s, and we have here the Nixon shock, August 1971, where there's now fully no connection to the dollar, to the currency, with gold. Americans can also hold gold again, which is a good thing, but the dollar has no connection to it. We're in a pure fiat standard from here. Vietnam War ends in 1975, and you can see, interestingly, with the ending of the Vietnam War also ends this peak of the Federal Reserve's ownership of United States debt. It goes up to 18%, and from here it starts to fall. The Smithsonian Agreement, this was an agreement to try to keep a connection to gold alive with a few countries at this statutory, not $35 an ounce, which was Roosevelt's devalued number, but $42 an ounce. That ended here in 1976. And we see through the 80s here, the Federal Reserve's portion of the United States debt falls, although notice here what's happening. A little bit more of institutionalization, I'd say, because both are rising. Okay, it's not like before where the Federal Reserve's portion was stable or even falling, really in the early days. Now you can see here, like from the start of the 60s, again, we're at that 30 billion, 10% number, 30 billion for the Fed, 300 billion total. The Fed has 10%. Let's just watch as we get through the Vietnam War here. Even after the Vietnam War ends, there's more and more debt being issued by the government. We hit $1 trillion on this chart, $1,000 billion of federal government debt here in November 1981, October actually. October 1981. Get over $1 trillion in federal debt. The Federal Reserve's portion does decline, but look, the Federal Reserve's portion is rising all the same. It's going up 130 billion by the end of this chart. At the start of the 1980s, roughly $1.2 trillion in federal government debt. The Federal Reserve's portion is still rising 150 billion, but as a percentage, because the US continues to issue more and more debt in this fiat standard, the Federal Reserve's percentage has fallen. That's all I want to show here for today. Tomorrow we'll bring it into the modern era. Thanks for watching.